Hi, my name is Kat, and I have some thoughts about Shadow and Bone. I, like every other person on the internet, was absolutely entranced by the Netflix TV series Shadow and Bone. It was an especially interesting experience for me because I remember reading the original Shadow and Bone trilogy by author Leigh Bardugo around 2015, about 3 years after it was published in 2012. Back then, I was very much into YA fiction and a lot of fantasy in general. And that remains true of my taste in books today, but I remember reading that series originally, liking it, disliking some aspects, and mostly feeling lukewarm about the whole thing. However, when I opened up my Netflix sometime around April 23rd and saw Shadow and Bone trending on the front page, it all came rushing back. I remember briefly hearing on the YA reader interwebs at some point that this project was going forward with a TV show, and I remember feeling quite skeptical because, let's face it, those of us who read YA have been stung by adaptations in the past, and there's a huge amount of adaptations that have been announced, hyped, and never really gotten off the ground. So I was kind of amazed to open my Netflix tab and see this beautiful cinematic trailer. After staying up to roughly 2 a.m. and binging all of the episodes, I can say that I am now firmly a Shadow and Bone TV show fan. The season hit right around the time I was finishing my final exams for my last year of university, and it was the first thing I picked up as soon as I finished that last exam. I immediately obtained copies of the books so that I could reread them and compare it to the show. And I also finally got around to reading the Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom duology that Leigh Bardugo also published, that takes place in the same universe 2 years after the fact, and whose characters show up in the show in kind of a prequel story. My thoughts on the original series have changed considerably in the past 6 or so years since I read them in the first place. What I can now say, since I have both watched the TV show and reread the books, and also dipped into the Six of Crows source material, is that the Shadow and Bone TV show was a really interesting example of adaptation. Adaptations of books in general have a pretty checkered and interesting history, some of which I'm going to try and dip into in this video. But also as a reader of the books who enjoyed them, even though I wouldn't consider myself the biggest book stan, I think that I have a few opinions that I can contribute on the adaptation process. Most of all, I was amazed how faithful the showrunners stayed to the spirit, characters, and overall arcs of the story while making some pretty drastic changes in terms of plot and other things. I also want to talk about some of the things that I'm excited with about the show, some changes that they made. So most of all, I just kind of want to explore the interesting way that this show was adapted from the books. So before we really get into it, I just want to put out a spoiler warning. I am going to be referring to a lot of the events in the show. This is, kind of an adaptational review, which kind of goes over how they adapted plot and characters and specific aspects from the book to the show. If you haven't watched the show, first of all, what the heck are you doing? Go watch the show. Watch it now. And if you're done watching it the first time, watch it a second time so we definitely get a second season. And second of all, I forgot what second of all was. So keep that in mind before you watch this video. Also, I'm probably going to be releasing a lot more Shadow and Bone related content because if you can't already tell, I am low-key obsessed with this show. Okay, maybe I'm high-key obsessed with this show and I have no one to talk about it. So I'm just going to spill all my thoughts onto the internet and you're going to have to listen to me. Or if you want to listen to me, you can subscribe to my channel and wait for more content. Okay, so with no further ado, let's get into discussion of the adaptation. So for a brief description of how the Shadow and Bone TV show was brought into being, this is the information that I was currently able to track down on how exactly this happened. Leigh Bardugo has had widespread success with her Grishaverse novels, including the Shadow and Bone trilogy, the Six of Crows duology, and her more recent entries, such as Rule of Wolves and King of Scars, two novels that I have not quite gotten around to reading yet. Eric Heiser, who's best known for his involvement in the Oscar-winning 2016 film Arrival, which was amazing, by the way, had an interest in the project, initially because someone handed him a copy of Six of Crows and he really enjoyed it. So when Netflix was considering optioning the series and they were shopping around for a showrunner, Eric was very eager to do it. And he was also very eager to integrate not only the Shadow and Bone plotline from the original trilogy, but also the Six of Crows. Now, at the time, Netflix had not obtained the rights to Six of Crows, but apparently Eric insisted that they include both in the adaptation. Apparently, Lee had been shopping around the idea to various places in Hollywood with varying levels of success. But it wasn't until Netflix and Eric Heiser got on board that Lee felt that the story was actually going to be treated with the due respect. And then on January 10th, 2019, it was announced that Shadow and Bone, the show, would be coming to Netflix, and with the author Leigh Bardugo on as an executive producer, which is pretty notable. Since the show was released by Netflix on April 23rd, 2021, it has received rather good reviews. Review aggregation sites like Rotten Tomatoes and IMDb seem to show that the show has a good amount of appeal to both critics and audience members. And also the show seems to have been able to achieve what is the ultimate goal of adaptations, which is to please both most of the fans as well as new and unfamiliar audiences. And part of the reason that I wanted to analyze this show in particular is because it succeeds in that area where a lot of adaptations have failed, especially of young adult content. Early adaptations of young adult novels like The Hunger Games or Twilight, regardless of the backlash they received, were also really well received by the public. Whereas the, succession of young adult adaptations to TV and movies afterwards never really achieved the same amount of success. Based on my observations, these sorts of adaptations tend to be either hated by general audiences, the fans, or in the worst cases, both. So it's kind of interesting to see a show that actually managed to successfully straddle that line. One thing also interesting about Shadow and Bone is that you'd expect it to be kind of a low-budget thing, like the Shadowhunters TV show on Netflix has had. However, Shadow and Bone is a very sleek 8-episode prestige TV series, which for a young adult series is pretty crazy. Overall, the show looks good. It has good production value. It's shot well. It was kind of amazing how everything kind of converged to make this show possible. They had actors who committed. They had set designers, costumers who committed. The directors were good. The fight scene choreography was good. The special effects were actually really good. There's only like a few parts of the CG that look kind of and for a TV show, that's pretty damn good. A lot of shows on Netflix, which are previously adapted from Y, don't really have that kind of prestige TV look and feel, where Shadow and Bone at times looks absolutely cinematic. And I think that they did a really good job of that. Overall, I think that the Shadow and Bone adaptation succeeds because the writers, producers, executive producers, actors, and really all of the staff seem to have a lot of respect for the source material.
When I was going through the scripts, and this was true of the scripts and the books, actually, whenever I got to a really kind of juicy line or a moment of tension, I find myself just reading out loud to myself.
They knew when to make changes that would not impact the story, even if they piss off a few fans. And most of the choices that they made still maintained the integrity of the most important parts. They retained the heart of the series, they retained the character relationships for the most part, and enhanced those relationships where they kind of didn't work quite as well in the books, which we'll get to Mal. We will talk about Mal. And they also managed to integrate 2 plot lines that, whereas the original book only had one first-person perspective plot line. So I really enjoyed how they managed to integrate the other elements using characters from Six of Crows and essentially created an original story to go alongside the whole thing. I thought it was actually really well executed, and this is the sort of thing that you don't typically see in adaptation. While some characters were certainly given less screen time than they deserved, or some aspects were handled differently from the source material, there wasn't really any egregious cases of complete character murder. I know that a lot of you are going to want to debate about whether or not Kaz is too soft or not ruthless enough in this series, but I think that the show offers kind of an alternative look at these characters, and I think it has some valuable additions to the characterization that I want to discuss a bit later on, or I might reserve for another video. So, in summary, the main plot lines of the show are, first of all, Alina discovering that she's the mythical sun summoner, being taken to learn from the Grisha about her powers in the hope of destroying the Shadowfold and restoring Ravka as a unified nation. In the meantime, there are various power players who are trying to interfere with that, and people in the palace that have their own interests when it comes to Alina's power that she has to kind of navigate. There's also Mal, who has been separated from his close childhood friend and spends most of the season trying to reunite with Alina. And then finally, there's the crows, Kaz, Nej, and Jesper, who are a delight to watch, who basically have to cross the fold, find a way into the little palace, kidnap Alina, and want to bring her back to deliver to this merchant. As you can imagine, there are various kind of bumps along the way, but it's really, really good how these kind of disparate plot elements are woven together into something that is both comprehensible and emotionally resonant. One of the things about production that is kind of relevant when it comes to seeing how successful the adaptation was, the amount of screen time that they had. They had 8 episodes, each about 45 minutes to 50 minutes long, roughly 8 hours, and they were kind of 50-50ing both the crows coming after Alina, a smaller subplot with some side characters, Nia and Matthias, who were more kind of relevant to presumably future seasons, and the Crow's independent story, which takes place after the timeline of Shadow and Bone. And the other rough half was Alina's story. So it's particularly interesting to see the way that they did this because the Crow's storyline was basically completely invented, and it's kind of remarkable how good they were at preserving that. One of the things that I'm really happy they managed to carry over from the books is a lot of the main emotional beats and really the kind of heart of the show, which are the characters, the overall emotional aspects to the story. One of the important things that they highlighted in the show that was also central to the books, but arguably not carried off quite as well, was the closeness and intimacy and importance of the relationship between Alina and Mal. Mal in the books is kind of a controversial character for some very understandable reasons. His character in the book is a bit more unlikable and at times kind of toxic and possessive towards Alina, but TV show Mal is really great. He's kind of like a lovable, sexy puppy. He goes through so much crap in the course of this show to get back to Alina that you're just like, this man deserves a happy ending and I'm invested in him. They really kind of double down on the aspect of Mal and Alina being one another's family. In the first episode, they do a lot of great stuff to establish how important these two are to one another and how their relationship is like kind of verging on this romantic relationship where neither of them are kind of willing to take the leap. But the first episode kind of takes its time introducing us to these characters and showing in kind of small, subtle ways how they kind of fight for one another, even when the other person doesn't realize. We have a flashback to Alina defending Mal as kids, and then we have a plot point where Mal steals food for Alina because, due to some racist crap, she didn't end up getting dinner at the army mess. So it really establishes like how much these two matter to one another, and Alina actually takes some actions to get on that skiff with Mal because she cares so much about him surviving. And Mal also has kind of a response to that where he doesn't want her to be put in harm's way as well. They do an amazing job kind of doubling down on this. And this is very important because after the first episode, Mal and Alina are very quickly separated. And so much of what kind of propels the first, I guess, 4 to 5 episodes of the series is this kind of tension of whether or not Mal and Alina are going to get to see each other again, and whether or not their bond will endure, even though their life circumstances have changed so much. Alina is very quickly kind of elevated to this venerated status, and she comes across multiple problems in the course of training for her power, where she feels very much like an outsider, in part in the show due to the fact that she is biracial and part Shu and very much coded as the enemy. There's a lot of kind of racist microaggression towards her. But the point is that Mal and Alina have been kind of relying on one another for so long. She didn't want to be separated from Mal. These two characters are in the show have such an obvious bond, and they're obviously the most important people in each other's lives. So I think that it was really important to hold that thread steady, because I feel like that was the main idea that Lee was originally trying to convey with the original series. And it's really the relationship that kind of ties together a lot of the choices the characters make. So the showrunners did a really smart thing in making that relationship very clear, establishing it in a good way, making sure both characters were more likable and enjoyable, and also not really shying away from the sentimentality and importance of that relationship to both of these characters. But they also managed to kind of cut up the series with a fair amount of drama and action unrelated to that romance. So a lot of the viewers who might not be a big fan of the kind of sappy YA stuff also have a lot to gain from the series. I feel like with a lot of YA adaptations, there was a lot of hesitancy to dive into the relationships sincerely or engage with them honestly, because YA comes with a lot of somewhat cringy and admittedly annoying tropes to some people. Personally, I enjoy YA, but I'm also somewhat critical of a lot of the tropes that show up in the genre. And a lot of people's mileage really, really varies with these sorts of things. There's a lot of amazing action sequences in this show. I'm surprised not too many people are talking about it. I think they pulled off the special effects for the Grisha super well. We've got, some great heart-render action, and they really sell things like the Squallers, throwing their wind, and the Inferni throwing their fire. And they really, cut up most of the episodes with action sequences. In sections of the story in the original Shadow and Bone storyline following Alina and Mal that are generally more low-key, like there's a few weeks that are condensed into a couple episodes in the show, mostly around episodes 3, 4, and a little bit of 5, that would otherwise be fairly boring to audiences that are looking for kind of a high octane or kind of fun, propulsive action fantasy story. I think they did a really interesting thing with using the crows to kind of add action and drama and cut it up with some kind of different sorts of excitement, while we have the kind of more melodramatic, emotionally centered story with Alina and Mal going on. And then they also do a really good, seamless job, in my opinion, of integrating the two storylines, especially around episode 5, where everything kind of hits the fan at once. Episode 5 is probably one of my favorites of the entire series, not only because it has some great moments for those who ship Alina and the Darkling. I'm not a stan, but I think that Ben Barnes might be luring me into being a fan with the incredibly dark and emotionally rich depths of his eyes. I swear I'm done swooning over Ben Barnes. So in episode 5, we have Mal having found a way to get to the palace, and then the crows arriving at the palace, figuring out what Alina looks like, and making the plan to basically seize her during this big party. We've got Alina. She's finally going to come into her power and take a stand against the fold. And then we also have the great twist reveal that fans of the book will know, but newcomers of the show won't. So all of this stuff converges in this really satisfying way. We have the crows executing a plan. We have Alina coming to this world-changing realization about how she has put her trust in the wrong people. We have some great character moments between the crows. And then we also have the ending, which ties up in probably one of the funniest ways, is pure gold. I love it. Same Jesper. I was laughing exactly the same way that you were. I really enjoyed the humor in this series because it's not always just verbal humor. It's just this kind of wry situational humor. And then it kind of kicks off the second half of the plot. Then, in a pretty genius use of body horror, Alina has the stag antlers literally grafted into her skin, which honestly, it's kind of gross, it's kind of gory, but it's probably one of my favorite deviations from the books, because originally it was this kind of like spiky, stag antler necklace that was like not grafted into her skin. It was just kind of a necklace. And everyone who read the books, including me, probably had this collective, oh my god moment where we were surprised how horrific it looked. And then it all kind of culminates in all of the main characters, including Mal and Alina and the crows, getting on a skiff, crossing the fold, and there's this big showdown where everyone gets in on the action. And the crows, who like didn't exist in the original books, have like an active role in the final fight scene. And there were some genuinely jaw-dropping moments for me because I had no idea where the crow storyline was going to go. But I think that they did a really good job of like making them feel relevant. One of the things I really appreciated about the writing and the ways that they modified the plot for television is that they managed to preserve the main important overarching plot elements without sacrificing little details that would really kneecap them down the line for future seasons if they wanted to continue to directly adapt from the Shadow and Bone book series. And ultimately, they showed a pretty good degree of fidelity towards the characters and their belief systems, interests, and general personalities. Of course, there's lots of debate as to like whether or not these characters are exactly like their book counterparts, especially with the very much beloved crows. But a lot of the changes, I think, were positive and were made for good adaptational reasons. I think one of the reasons that this series does not really get a lot of flack for the changes they made is that they made changes, for the most part, that were totally acceptable to the fans, and they understood what the fans were attached to and what they could cut. And they also added or modified some elements that did not work in the original series, like Mel's personality in general, and they really did a great job of overhauling those elements. They also found a really interesting way to overhaul the plot, because the original series, because it was in first-person perspective, left out a lot of details about the world or implied some things that were never really capitalized on. And I feel like the show really seized the opportunity to make these changes. For example, they kind of grasp onto the idea that like West Ravka on the other side of the fold has a secession movement going on because they've been separated for hundreds of years and are sick of supporting the other side and want to kind of form their own independent country. They fleshed that out. They created a new kind of original character to kind of headline that cause, and they highlighted that a lot, especially in the Crows timeline. They created, a new fun character called the Conductor for the Crows to bounce off of, who was kind of a fun, interesting, and surprisingly sneaky character who did a really good job of kind of playing off of the Crows and adding some kind of added intrigue and tension to the whole story. A lot of the areas that the story suffered in was definitely world building, establishing the setting, establishing the magic system. But I feel like in terms of the show, those are kind of worthwhile trades, because I feel like they've made the right choice with the limited time and budget they had to prioritize kind of the main heart and soul and plot of the stories, whereas a lot of the world building that wasn't immediately relevant to the plot can be kind of filled in later when it becomes more relevant. As with any fantasy show that kind of has multiple countries, it is very difficult to kind of establish difference in settings. In the case of this show, it seems like they were filming pretty much exclusively in Hungary around Budapest. So they didn't, have the kind of necessarily the time or budget or special effects or, time to build more sets for countries like, the Shuhan, which could have required a lot more elaboration, or Kerch and Ketterdam, which are a separate nation, and that wasn't entirely clear because they wanted to avoid giving you those big, clunky exposition dumps. And they could have also fleshed out a little bit more the geography of East and West Ravka and exactly where characters are on which side of the fold and so on. But I think all of those are mainly issues related to how much of a budget Netflix gave the show and also just the resources that they had on hand. And I think that prioritizing the character and the emotions and the overall kind of spirit was a better trade-off than kind of creating this really elaborate world without really creating compelling or interesting or lovable characters. In addition, the parts that they did focus on in terms of setting really seemed to show a really great dedication to detail. Like, for example, a lot of the main massive and interesting sets they had, like the army camp or the fold or Ketterdam in the few scenes we saw it, or the Crow Club, have amazing amounts of detail. The costumes and backgrounds are awesome. They were filming in a castle in Hungary, and it just looks amazing. All of the, Grisha in the background have these beautifully stitched keftas, and Wendy Partridge, who did the costuming for it, was super, super on point with all of those kind of aesthetic details. Probably, I think the biggest asset for this show when it came to successful adaptation was that there was obviously a lot of passion and investment on the parts of the creators. Based on, interviews that I've seen with both Eric Heiser, Lee Bardugo, one of the writers of the show, Christina Strain, and a lot of the kind of behind the scenes info that we've gotten, it seems that a lot of people were invested in this show. Most of the actors, including Ben Barnes, read many of the books and were actually genuinely in love with their book counterparts.
You can just beam with pride at everybody that's been involved. From the day players who came in with a few lines and had always read all of the books, which was incredible to me. That was a big thing for me, knowing that people whose characters weren't even in the books would come on having read all of them and being so invested in the dynamics of the world.
It's so wonderful as a YA book fan to see people like legitimately invested in these characters, and it's an absolute delight to see the passion that these up-and-coming young actors have for these roles. And, Ben Barnes, who's kind of an older actor who is in with all of these like 20-something relatively new actors.
Narnia, Prince Caspian, starring Ben Barnes.
Seventh Son, starring Ben Barnes.
Dorian Gray, starring Ben Barnes.
The Big Wedding, starring Ben Barnes.
Stardust, starring Ben Barnes.
Stitch up.
It's Jack and Ryan, isn't it?
Does anyone know
Starring
yet?
Ben Barnes.
Yeah, what is... No, I...
And just overall, it was the actors and the passion of the writers, producers, and other contributors that really sold the show. There's a lot of, kind of cliche line deliveries and kind of drama and melancholy, and all of the actors sold these things super well. Jessie May Lee alone was amazing. I spent a good amount of time on rewatch just looking at her expressions, even though in a lot of the scenes she's probably reacting to like, a tennis ball on a stick or something. When she's supposed to look terrified, she looks terrified. When she, looks shocked or tired or sad or completely head over heels for Ben Barnes, I buy it. And that goes the same for, Mal, Jesper, Inej, Kaz. All of the actors obviously knew the characters and were committed to the bit. Ben Barnes is probably the most skilled actor of the bunch just based on experience. And like in all of his scenes with Alina, like you get kind of both this idea that he is both manipulating her, but also has this, genuine draw and attraction to her. Like looking at his eyes in the scenes they have together is just a journey. It looks sincere. And the fact that he played it sincerely and was committed to it is so important, because in the hands of a less committed actor, it would not have been convincing. He played it with a good amount of nuance and depth, and obviously enjoyed the role. So it was just a delight to watch the cast work on it. And you can tell that the writers loved the books. They obviously had a great time writing in original roles like Arkin, the conductor, and the goat, who completely stole the show. And by the way, I love that they introduced that joke in one episode, referenced it in multiple episodes, and then ended up kind of paying that off with Mal. I love it so much when they have a joke and then they sustain that joke for the rest of the series, because then it's so much more impactful. I thought it was done really well. But I think they really towed the line really well between expositing enough for a new audience, or for people who are familiar with some of the books but not all of them, just to get a kind of grasp on what the plot and characters were like. But they also made sure that it was really interesting for people who had read the books, threw in little references to future characters or plot lines. They added fun little details in, like cameos by Lee Bardugo and the Shadow and Bone book itself, and had kind of little nods to a variety of things. So having gone through that massive rant that was honestly a lot more direct and less than I wanted it to be, I think I'm going to probably be creating some videos focusing on specific aspects of the show that I want to highlight. Things like little details I noticed from my 1 million rewatches. I know, I'm obsessed, but bear with me. And I also want to kind of take deeper dives on some of the character choices and adaptations they made. But if I did that in one video, like, this thing would be an eternity long. And also just, I want to kind of dive into some of the cool behind the scenes stuffs that we've learned, deleted scenes that have been circulating on the internet, and kind of give my 2 cents on that. If you're interested in watching more Shadow and Bone content by me, I have a brand new YouTube channel and I'm figuring this whole thing out, but I would really appreciate any feedback or suggestions you might have. If you want me to review the books, I can do that. If you want me to discuss specific aspects of the show, I am game. I love this show, if you can't tell. But either way, please subscribe for more videos. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the show. What did you think about some of the changes? What was your favorite part? What did you think about Milo? What did you think about the Darkling? What did you think about the casting for this show? What were some of the changes that you enjoyed? And what are some of the changes that absolutely drove you up the wall? I really want to know, and I'm really open to hearing what all of you think about it. Also, welcome to my YouTube channel, and I hope you stick around and find out more.